we're enabling our customers to install onboard applications that are vertical specific. So computing on the edge, AI on the edge will become more important. So if you ask me what's the next important big thing, that's being able to deploy software onto the drone, and that's exactly what we're enabling.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 359. If we had 10 minutes to spend with Auterion's CEO, what would we learn? For that question, we head to the floor of the AUVSI Xponential Drone Conference in Orlando, Florida, and speak with Lorenz Meier, CEO of Auterion. Auterion is the premier end-to-end operating system for commercial drones, based on open standards, flexibility, and choice. As many of you know, in 2008, Lorenz created and released the Pixhawk autonomous drone autopilot to the open source community. He is also the creator of Pixhawk, MAVLink, and QGroundControl, the most commonly used flight control hardware and autopilot software. Today, Auterion is the leader in open source operating systems. At Xponential, I had the opportunity to meet with Lorenz to talk about the Auterion ecosystem and the opportunities in the drone industry. But before we hear from Lorenz, I want to thank those of you who are supporting my funding campaign. Whether it's $1, $100, or much more, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And by the way, if you have a great story on the use of drones that you'd like to share in a podcast, contact me at randy@droneradioshow.com. So let's hear about the Auterion ecosystem and plans for the future. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Lorenz if the company had made any special announcements at Xponential.
We had quite a few. I think what you're seeing at this show is the success of our partner ecosystem and the overall ecosystem that we're building. We've had multiple announcements around integrations into drones. We had multiple announcements around software partnerships, around payload integrations, and that just shows that people start to understand that building all these relationships on a one-on-one basis is extremely wasteful and inefficient and not sustainable. And what we're providing with our open ecosystem is that companies can now just integrate with the Auterion platform. And for example, if you're a gimbal manufacturer or a camera manufacturer, you integrate once with us and we give you the tools to do it yourself. And then it works on a whole number of drones, on dozens of drones out of the box. I had a conversation with one of our partners, Bobby Watts, where he said, look, we just connected this gimbal and it just completely worked out of the box, and we've never spoken to the vendor, and that's a completely new experience for us, because up until then they wired stuff up and it didn't work and they needed to talk to the vendor. And he said, hey, that's really a proof that what you're trying to build is working, because it's making it so incredibly easy now for everybody.
How do you build on that ecosystem and continue to keep the momentum going so that it all does work together?
So I think there are two main things that we're doing. One important part is we're contributing a lot of the software we're building to the open source community. I mean, I'm the founder of PX4, I'm creator of the original Pixhawk, and we as a company strongly care about that. So Auterion contributes everything it does on the flight control side to the PX4 developer community, and we upstream all of that, and that also leads to, typically we have 50% of the contributions in the project, so we're doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And that's important because our partners see that. They see that we put our money where our mouth is. If we're saying hey, we help you become part of this wider developer community, that is bigger than Auterion itself. It's really PX4, it's really the open source community. They see that we're actually doing that. I think that's one important part. And the other part is, and that's a much more commercial argument, it's critical mass. We have drone OEMs with volume. We have like volume in mapping, in cargo. So if you are a component vendor or solutions provider and you're looking for like, where do I put my integration dollars, then the ROI in our ecosystem is just by default very high because it has that critical mass.
Plus, there's the benefit of having a legacy of Pixhawk users that may be part of that ecosystem today.
That is true, but I would say I'm even not sure if the user base is the main part that's appealing, because quite frankly, those systems have been relatively hard to use. They've been built for developers, they haven't built for end users. So I sometimes even find that users of the old open source days kind of have that preconceived notion that anything built on the basis of open source software has to be clunky. And that's not the case. You can have both if it's done properly. You can have open source core and then some additional tech around it that makes it really fun to use. Now, what I will say is what helps is that as we're saying like, hey, please use this protocol, please use MAVLink, please use the Pixhawk autopilot bus, that yes, that's not coming out of thin air. It's something that people are roughly familiar with already. It feels to them like a continuation of what they've already done. And then what's also important, Auterion is just part of a movement that is bigger than itself. So we're not setting these standards. These standards are set by the developer community. They're set by a nonprofit drone code that we're part of. So we don't get to own that. We're just part of that. The same way as, I don't know, for example, Intel isn't owning the USB standard, but of course Intel is a really important part of hardware standardization.
Which applications do you see are starting to emerge as really commercially viable or maybe really interesting applications?
So there are the typical applications that have been around for a long time. Construction, inspection, like surveying, mapping, and that hasn't really changed. So we have quite a few customers that work on these, and we have a announced integration with Esri, which is super cool, and they're also at the show. Now, in terms of new applications, I have to admit that I have been personally a skeptic of cargo via drones, in particular to consumers, for a very, very long time. But I'm now seeing how multiple companies in multiple continents are deploying that very successfully at a scale that I think even we in the industry tend to underestimate. Like Zipline has hundreds of thousands of deliveries in Africa. It's crazy. It's normal. It's everyday life. Like we can't imagine that. And now we're starting to see a huge ramp up with Mana in Ireland. We start to see in the US, Walmart, Drone Up, ramping, and it's becoming real. And we see that very, very clearly in our sales and our customers, in customer requests. So if you ask me, like the big news of 2022 is cargo drones are here to not to just stay, but scale.
When you see a trend like that emerge, what's the strategic planning thought process in how to prepare or maybe respond to that trend?
So we're building a platform, and we're building with that relatively generic infrastructure. And what I mean with that is we have an onboard operating system that does radio management and camera management and payload management, and also includes PX4, the open source project that I founded, but just basically the same code that everybody else has, and we're contributing actively to that. But Auterion's product are really the layers around camera, video link, data link, all that. And that applies to many verticals. From our perspective, it doesn't matter if you do inspection or mapping. It maybe matters how we position it in our sales process, but in the core product, it's really the same thing. Where it's a little bit different is for cargo. So for cargo, of course, you don't need the camera in the same way. You might use it, but not for capturing images. And so that's a little bit different, but it's still largely the same software on board. And the same applies to our cloud suite and our fleet management software. Well, for that, it doesn't matter if you're doing mapping or cargo. And then for our API that we're providing to our end customers, it's similar. It's, of course, a little bit a different API surface. And so I would say for our strategic planning, it's more important where the technology is going and where the whole field is going than individual verticals are going. From a account management and sales perspective, that's, of course, a wholly different game. Like how we approach the market, and you will probably see us talking more about cargo and similar applications in the future.
Is there anything about the company or the technology that you'd like to highlight?
I'm not sure of the company, but I would say something that generally is still not 100% here in this industry, and that it's important and paramount to think software-defined and network-centric, and that's what Auterion's DNA is. And what that means is I still sometimes have conversations where somebody says like, well, I can integrate my thing with your thing, and it's like, here's a Ethernet cable or an HDMI cable or whatever, and those times are over. It's all software now, and that's something that has to happen in order for us as an industry to have tighter integrations, the smartphone equivalent that everybody talks about but isn't quite there yet. And part of that is as well, we're enabling our customers to install onboard applications that are vertical specific. So computing on the edge, AI on the edge will become more important. It's super important, for example, for cargo, because you need to be sure that your delivery location is safe and clear, but it also applies to mapping and others. So if you ask me what's the next important big thing, that's being able to deploy software onto the drone, and that's exactly what we're enabling.
I spoke with someone yesterday who said, we really don't have a drone industry yet. We have a lot of drone companies, we have a lot of drone solutions, but not a fully integrated industry. He compared it to the early days of the automotive industry, where cars were being produced, and they had been for years, but it wasn't until around the time of the assembly line that people could buy a car and have everything in place to service and support its operations. What are your thoughts?
I think that's a fair statement. I very much agree with that. I think it's bespoke, low volume. If you compare it to the car industry, I think we're in the age of coach building. And then there are vendors, including us, that provide components to coach builders, and they make in their shed a couple of coaches. I think that's where we are at. And it's important to realize that, because what I find creates this cognitive dissonance is that people look at their smartphone and then they go like, well, I need this and at scale and whatnot. And then they turn around, and how we're then executing as an industry is extremely bespoke. Which is also why we still find that when I'm telling people, hey, you can't do your own software, it's just not possible. If you don't have like 20% market share, 10-20% market share, you will not be able to do it. I'm very often getting a reaction where people say like, yeah, but our stuff is different and it needs to be like we know this better, or but our system is so different than other people's systems. And it's like, yeah, but no. As long as you have those conversations, it's not a scalable industry. But I see a change there, and more vendors are coming around and are really focusing on what are we great at? Are we great at cost? Are we great at serving specific verticals? Are we great at a specific category of device? And then they're saying like, hey, we're great at this, and we're not trying to reinvent the wheel on all the other things. So we want to work with partners, with vendors, and that mindset is needed, because then it can become an industry.
One final question, Lorenz. What's your outlook for the future?
I'm pushing one statement and one number that I think fits here. I think what we are doing as an industry needs to become 100 times cheaper in operating cost, not necessarily in the hardware cost, but in operating cost. And that goes along how much training you need to operate a system, how much time it takes to upload the data to the cloud. In our case, we're doing that in real time automated, but if it's manual, it's too expensive. And for me, if we collectively as an industry manage to bring the cost down roughly 2 orders of magnitude, which means it needs to be a lot simpler to use, needs to require less training, it needs to have a much higher degree of automation when it comes to processing the data that drones create, then we will see also a 10 or 100x growth in adoption. Because if I'm looking right now at what companies are deploying in terms of number of drones compared to number of employees, it's very obvious that it's still a niche application.
That's it for episode 359 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Lorenz Meier of Auterion. I want to thank Lorenz for taking the time to speak with me at Xponential. If you want to learn more about Auterion or want to connect with Lorenz, check out the webpage at auterion.com. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.